Let's get into it. Let's find out what the story is behind this buddy boy Baxter, CC Baxter, played by Jack Lemmon, and one of Billy Wilder's most celebrated films. A lot of people say that Billy Wilder's best film is maybe it's Sunset Boulevard, maybe it's Double Indemnity, maybe it's Some Like It Hot, a film we talked about in Extra Milestone before. For my money, his masterpiece, his classic film, is easily The Apartment, which my first question for you, Julia, as we got to get this out of the way. What genre is The Apartment?
Oh my gosh. I feel like it straddles a couple of different genres. I think it could be a romantic comedy. Definitely, I think is the first genre that comes up first and foremost for a lot of people. Right. It's definitely a drama, given a lot of the heightened situations that a lot of characters fall into. It could also be a screwball comedy, given how some of those heightened moments might not carry over as serious to a lot of audience members. I can completely see that. There's a lot of very fast-paced dialogue that is especially done so well by Jack Lemmon and Fred MacMurray, both of whom worked with Billy Wilder. Fred MacMurray obviously had worked with him previously in Double Indemnity, which is such a straight, I mean, if you're looking for the blueprint of the film noir, look no further than Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity. But yeah, I think that it definitely straddles those three genres, subgenres pretty well. But personally for me, I find it to be kind of a romantic dramedy. It mixes drama really well. I think that I think that one of the best characters, my favorite character from the film, and we'll definitely get into our admiration of this character because I know both of us love her so much. My favorite character is Fran Kubelik, who is played so honestly, with so much genuine nature, with so much kindness and thoughtfulness, by Shirley Maclaine. That character really brings a lot of the emotional crux of the film. I think that she's the most developed character. I think that she is the most emotionally introspective character of the film.
Absolutely.
And I think that Jack Lemmon and Fred MacMurray, they're both kind of these binary figures in this office that they work in, but they're also foils of each other. There's this guy that Jack Lemmon plays, CC Baxter, our buddy boy, who is just trying to do everything that he can to make it in his workplace, something that I feel like so many of us can relate to, of just trying to be the best, do what you can on the side in order to get a leg up. And then Fred MacMurray, who is this hyper-masculine, presents this toxic masculinity, this verbose, unneeding, unnecessary figure who is just so emotionally manipulative to Shirley MacLaine's Fran Kubelik. And it's just such a fascinating character study with these two men. But I really believe that Fran Kubelik, who is performed so beautifully by Shirley MacLaine, is really the emotional crux of the film and gives a lot of that drama that we really need injected into this film to have that emotional weight, while Fred MacMurray and Jack Lemmon kind of have their witty banter and back and forth. And Jack Lemmon is this really kind of funny, almost quasi Jimmy Stewart-like good guy in The Office.
Really? See, I was going to compare Fred MacMurray more to the Jimmy Stewart presence, at least. And in this movie, of course, you wouldn't say that Jimmy Stewart would be the antagonist, or if he was, it would probably be against type. But I don't know. I compare Jack Lemmon a little bit in the same way Billy Wilder does to Chaplin a bit. Billy Wilder always said, Lemmon is my Chaplin, which maybe that's overstating things. But yes, when it comes to his comedic timing, his ability to switch from drama to comedy, like in a pinch, especially because watching this movie every single time, I always go into it and I'm like, why do I like this character? He's doing things I don't like, and he's making decisions, and the dialogue he's saying is so terrible. Like a terrible person says things like this and treats Shirley MacLaine's character this way. But for some reason, he brings a heart to it in his own way, through his mannerisms, through his slight performance tics. And that's why every time I watch The Apartment, I find myself falling for this schmuck just like Fran seems to.
Yeah, I definitely agree that I think where I come across with the Jimmy Stewart nature is just the wholesomeness of it. You know that it
Oh,
isn't,
sure.
it's not, how should I say this? There isn't an antagonistic guide to his character perspective. You know, I think that the one point where CC Baxter really loses the audience is when Frank Kubelik is, you know, we'll get to it, but I don't want to ruin it for that many people. I don't want to get into spoilers, but there is a moment where CC Baxter does kind of lose the audience in terms of their identification with the protagonist, because he's definitely presented that way. He's presented as this by the numbers, wholesome guy who seems to just be doing his job and doing everything he can to get a leg up in his office, which who could blame him, especially considering the post-World War II 1960s sort of desks in a row, timestamp sort of situation that they were living in, that some people might still be living in now, who is just trying to get his life together, get that corner office, and then know that he has finally made it. And then he can have kind of this free-for-all life that someone like J.F. Sheldrake, who's Fred MacMurray's character, kind of has, with the moral compass.
We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because I want to talk more about this character, but for those who haven't seen the movie, we definitely should set the stage a little bit. So we've talked about the cast and kind of what brings this movie together emotionally. But okay, what's the plot? This movie begins with some voiceover narration, kind of a risky move. It's something that can be seen as sort of tropey. It's not like critics at the time were super nice to this movie anyway. It was kind of mixed at first, but then it ended up getting nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards. And of course, it's gone on to be quite well remembered, as we know. But anyway, it does start with the voiceover narration, and we immediately find out this Baxter is an insurance guy. So they chose a very, workman-like job for him. And the idea of insurance kind of plays out throughout the whole movie. The idea of like, what is this man really worth? Everyone is just sort of a number. One of the big themes of this movie that I really enjoy is just that back and forth of, are people human beings? Are they mensches? Or are they people who are going to get took? And there's a lot of drama in that situation. There's a lot of that drives the romance. It drives the misunderstandings that happen between characters. So I like that the film gets it right out of the way that, yes, he works in an insurance company. It's not a flashy job. It's not something that seems like immediately valuable. It's a job that's all about sort of selling yourself a bit, which of course plays into, as we quickly learn, that Baxter, who wants people to call him Bud and his higher ups call him Buddy Boy all the time, he loans out his apartment, which is in the Upper West Side, to a bunch of people, a bunch of senior coworkers who...
A bunch of men.
A bunch of dudes. And they are a bunch of toxic boys who are wanting to find a spot to have affairs because they're married men. And in this time and age, I looked this up because I was curious. I was like, well, why don't they do hotels? Are they that cheap? I think that is part of it, that they are pretty cheap. And here's this guy who will loan out his apartment for free. And in exchange, as you've kind of teased already, he's doing this to get ahead, because if he loans out his apartment to these guys, maybe they're going to help him out in the future. And that's kind of how we get introduced to him. We're kind of like, he's a bit of a schmuck. He's a bit of a guy who's sort of doing unsavory things in order to get a promotion, because we see little moments in the movie where whenever he tries to do like his actual job, nobody seems to care. And I thought that was a pretty funny wrinkle of the film, especially when you notice it on rewatch.
Definitely. And I mean, especially going back to that immediate voiceover that you talked about, it's very clear that this C.C. Baxter, he's a knowledgeable guy. He's incredibly aware. I think that there are actually moments where he talks to Fran Kubelik and he's able to recite the address where she lives. And it's just a very fascinating character study of this person who is very clearly overworked. And honestly, I think that we can even consider those hours where he rents out his apartment to the higher ups, the supervisors that he works for. We consider that overtime for the kind of work that he's doing just to get ahead in his job. It's such a fascinating character study. I think that it could transfer so easily to a lot of situations that people are working in nowadays in corporate America. And minus the elevator girls, it's such a wonderful workplace romantic dramedy. I think that that's what I always keep going back to, is that it's this one building that's containing these three people, this one institution
Yeah,
of
it feels so
working
small
of
too.
yeah, of working under capitalism and just trying to make a buck, get somewhere. Even Fran Kubelik talks about, trying to find a place for herself atop the elevator girls at one point in passing. I think it's not taken with too much seriousness, but it's really, it's an intense world that this CC Baxter has to live in, and that feeling that you have to give the extra mile or go the extra mile in order to just get to a place where you feel like you have some agency and some control over your circumstances. I think one of the reasons why it has stood the test of time and why so many people still love it is because a lot of those circumstances still feel very prescient and very contemporary for a lot of people.
Right, because we're sort of sold this idea that, all right, if you work hard, if you're really good at what you do, that's all you really need for success. And I always enjoy a movie that sort of points the flaws in that and says, that's not really how it is. We all know that. And does it in a very disarming way, in a reasonable way, in a way that can start discussions with people about, yeah, haven't you ever been in a situation like this where your promotion wasn't really about you? It was about you doing things for other people that were unrelated to the job. And so I actually have a clip here from the movie, Julia, that we could play that maybe kind of ties into what we're talking about.
Let's listen.
Sorry to bother you, buddy boy, but the little lady forgot her galoshes.
Mr. Kirkby, I don't like to complain, but you were supposed to be out of here by 8.
I know, buddy boy, I know, but those things don't always run on schedule like a Greyhound bus.
Well, I don't mind in the summer. It's but on a rainy night. I haven't had any dinner yet.
Sure. Look, kid, I put in a good word for you with Sheldrake and personnel.
Mr. Sheldrake?
That's right. We were discussing our department, manpower-wise, promotion-wise. I told him what a bright boy you are. They're always on the lookout for young executives.
Thank you.
You're on your way up, buddy boy. You're also out of liquor.
Oh, I know. Yeah, Mr. Eichelberger, Mortgage and Loan Department. Last night he had a little Halloween party.
Yeah, well, lay in some vodka and some vermouth and put my name on it.
Yes, Mr. Kirkby. You still owe me for the last 2 bottles.
Yeah, I'll pay you on Friday.
What I love about that too is that, they don't pay him back. They just take advantage of this guy, and it's so sad to see, but he doesn't seem to really notice it. And he doesn't really seem to notice that he's being pressured in a way that's pretty messed up, especially if you're watching it with modern eyes. But even in the time, I think that this was a pretty scandalous movie for just like the, adulterous nature of it and what it was saying in a very provocative way about a workplace culture that at the time was very, very well defended by people.
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing that I actually thought of based on our previous conversation before we even went into the clip was this idea of paying your dues, and that is such it's this idea that has been embedded in so many people's minds, especially under this capitalistic economic situation that we're all in under this country, and having to feel like we have to not just work, but work even harder in order to attain the kind of position that we want. But not just the position, it means that we're getting the respect that we want. It seems like those two things are mutually exclusive under that kind of capitalistic, and especially during that time period. I mean, this film came out in 1960? This was still after the World War II boom. Everyone was ready to go to work, to get back to work, to continue to feed into this economy that had such a huge boom, and everyone was experiencing the kind of fruits of the labor that so many people had given to it. And this idea of these people gave so much, you need to give the same, was kind of passed down generationally into people who went back to work following World War II. And it's so fascinating to kind of see this circumstance in the apartment where this one man is willing to go such a distance. And I mean, such a distance with like 18 U's and the such in order
out in the cold for hours.
Exactly. Within the first 20 minutes, we see the lengths that this young man is willing to go in order to procure himself possibly just not even the opportunity to move up in the ranks, but just the chance.
Yeah, he has to trust their word.
Exactly. And the fact of the matter is that even after that opening scene that we see with him standing out in the cold, waiting for this adulterous man and his mistress to leave, even after all of that, he's not guaranteed to move up in the ranks at his office. It has to go through this entire narrative in order for him to actually find a place or find the chutzpah in order to say, you know what, I'm not going to deal with this anymore. But I also want to give a shout out to, there's that beautiful musical interlude that you played that the music was actually done by Adolf Deutsch, who actually earned his very first Academy Award nomination for Best Original Score for this film. He went on to win 3 Oscars for his work in Oklahoma, in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, and in Annie, Get Your Gun. All 3 of those were movie musicals during the height of this kind of golden age in Hollywood. And I just think the music is also kind of what brings me into the movie. And as soon as I heard those first few tones from that clip that you played, I just fell right back into that black and white space, into that really nice apartment. I think we should talk about how nice CC Baxter's apartment is in New York.
Nothing fancy, but cozy for a bachelor.
As someone who lives in New York, I would give anything to strain my pasta with a tennis racket in order to live in an apartment like that.
Yeah, it really was a different time too, just in the sense that back then that is what would be considered like cozy, but it's so spacious and the furniture is really nice. And of course, it's all set dressing for the sake of the film. And, I've always likened the apartment itself to representing Baxter. I kind of said earlier that his job sort of suggests the idea that he's loaning himself out to others. That's really what this is, because the apartment is supposed to be a place where he is supposed to be healed, where he is supposed to be resting and being himself, his authentic self, but he loans that out to other people just to get ahead.
Yeah, I really feel like, thinking back to it a little bit more, it's a very cluttered space, which is very kind of odd for this kind of bachelor figure who you really don't think, he's living by himself. He doesn't have a lot of people to entertain. He's working all the time. Why would he have a lot of people to entertain? And yet he's, with maybe these extra bucks that he's getting from his bonuses, he's kind of sprucing up the place to make it more amiable for supervisors, higher ups to enjoy, in order that he can kind of secure himself a space in his company in the future for him to just be like, this is my space now and no one else's. It's really fascinating to look at the set design of that space. But then it's just I just love watching Jack Lemmon just strain that pasta with a tennis racket. It's one of my favorite images from that movie.
It really is great. I love just his comedic timing too, how quick he is on the uptake. I know we were talking about this off the air, but us both being former tennis players, and I'm a former tennis player. I guess you're still a professional as far as I can tell.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Tennis enthusiast. It's one of my favorite scenes. Yeah, I do want to get to the music at some point, because there is plenty to discuss there. This is one of the reasons it's one of my favorite films is the way it uses its music in the story. Like, there is a story behind the specific arrangement here. Before we get to that, last thing I'll say about that, some of those earlier scenes, the thing I love about Billy Wilder and I.A.L. Diamond as screenwriters is how they take these very pathetic moments and they make comedy out of it. They make light of it so that you don't feel like emotionally manipulated. You just feel like somebody is like talking to you like a person about something that is kind of depressing in a lot of ways. That specific moment is just seeing him drink like the backwash of the liquor in his water and saying cheers, because he's literally living off the scraps of his bosses. That always resonates with me quite a bit, because it is a moment that should just make me feel so sorry for this guy. But instead, I kind of feel connected to him just as a real person. And since this is a movie that's all about, connecting with people in an authentic way, I think that it's a pretty effective way to start out your movie. And this first half of the movie that we're talking about, definitely to what you're saying, it is more of the workplace comedy aspect of it. It hasn't really turned into the romantic drama comedy yet, which is so classic Wilder in his directing, because he's so good at genre bending. And this is a very experimental film in some ways because of how, by the halfway point, which we'll talk about, it turns into a completely different movie in some ways. It does kind of lean more heavy into the romance than it does previously, but let's talk about that romance, because it's not too long before we're finally introduced to Shirley Maclaine's character. Now, at this point in her career, Shirley Maclaine had not worked with Billy Wilder quite yet. She would work with him again a few years later, and Jack Lemmon again. But at this point in 1960, she had been an actress for about 5 years. We, of course, know Shirley Maclaine. She's still alive today. She was in a film as recently as last year. I've told you, Julia Teti, in confidence, that Shirley Maclaine has been one of my role models since childhood. I am a fan of her quite a bit. I know some people kind of make fun of the new age spirituality stuff, but I think it is very fun. But anyway, all that aside, we finally get introduced to her as an elevator operator. And Julia, guess what? I may have a clip for that as well.
I can't wait to hear it.
Morning, Mr. Kirk.
Morning, Miss Kubelik.
Good morning, Mr. Baxter.
Morning, Miss Kubelik.
That's all. Take it away.
Watch the door, please. Blasting off.
What did you do to your hair?
It was making me nervous, so I chopped it off. Big mistake, huh?
No, I sort of like it.
You got a lulu.
Huh? Yeah, I better not get too close.
I never catch colds.
Really? I was reading some figures from the Sickness and Accident Claims Division. Do you know that the average New Yorker between the ages of 20 and 50 has 2.5 colds a year?
Now, that makes me feel just terrible.
Why?
Well, to make the figures come out even, if I have no colds a year, some poor slob must have 5 colds a year.
Yeah, it's me.
Should have stayed in bed this morning.
I should have stayed in bed last night.
From the get-go, I just find this character so relatable. Like, it's just the fact that, like, chopping it off, and of course that kind of hints at some things that are very specific to her character later on. But yeah, what do you think of our introduction to Fran Kubelik here?
Oh my gosh, I love Fran Kubelik as a character. She's one of my favorite characters in cinema. And, you know, I can't give enough credit to Shirley Maclaine's performance in this movie. It's one of my absolute favorites. This performance actually garnered Shirley Maclaine her second Oscar nomination for Best Actress in a Leading Role. She wouldn't win her first Oscar until 1984 for Best Actress in a Leading Role for the film Terms of Endearment, which she starred alongside Deborah Winger, a film that I have seen absolutely wrecked me and sent me into an emotional spiral. But this movie also, with her performance as Fran Kubelik, I think that there is so much actually in that little scene that you played for us. I want to first talk about this kind of snarky comment that she makes about her hair. So I don't know if a lot of people know about this, but in the 1920s, a lot of hairdressers discouraged young women from bobbing their hair and cutting it so short because it would make women look boyish, which actually wouldn't lend young men to be attracted to them because it wouldn't make them look feminine and they wouldn't have long hair. And so that was one of the first things that I thought about whenever I saw Fran Kubelik with her really short hair. She wanted to look boyish. She didn't want a lot of other men in the office looking at her. She only had eyes and wanted the only eyes on her to be one particular man in the office, which we will get into later on in the conversation. I also think that it demonstrates her absolutely quick wit, which I really don't think that we can not only limit that to Shirley Maclaine's performance, because it's grade A from the get-go, but we also have to give a lot of credit to Billy Wilder's writing and directing. His writing has been known to be very fast-paced, kind of like a ping pong tournament where it's just back and forth between two or a couple of characters in a scene. And that scene that you just played for us when CC Baxter meets Fran Kubelik, which are two characters who have been interacting before we as an audience are placed into this narrative, they've been seeing each other every day. We understand that CC Baxter has this really innocent, really boyish, very kind of what's the word? It's not
non-threatening in some ways.
It's non-threatening. It's a really non-threatening crush.
He's got a
over
crush,
this young girl.
Little crush, and why blame him? I mean.
Exactly. I mean, it's really sweet. It's really innocent. We don't get the sense that this is a young man who feels like he's come into his masculinity in order to manipulate it against this young woman. In fact, I feel kind of like this young woman has the upper hand over Cece Baxter in terms of her really quick brain, her very driven command over the language that she uses. I mean, I think one sequence that happens right after that scene that you played is that one of the men in the back of the elevator, as he is exiting, slaps her on her butt.
Yeah.
And she makes a frame with her fingers and she says, Mr. So-and-so, if you do that again, I'm just going to have to slam the door on you. And it's really great the way that, I don't know if it was Shirley Maclaine's choice, if it was Billy Wilder's choreography, but she outlines the elevator and then puts her hand in the middle and the other hand on the side to show that she would just push the elevator on him and just close the doors to him completely. I think that especially during that time, you know, Fran Kubelik also represents a woman who had to put up with a lot of bullshit from a lot of men. Working as an elevator girl, just she's a grown woman and her title is elevator girl. I mean, that alone in and of itself, it lends itself to this idea that this young woman, young professional woman who has to deal with so much, interact with so many different people throughout the day, throughout the week, is just placed into such a lower ranking when she is providing a service that at that time was incredibly essential for so many people, still essential for so many people. And she's treated like this. Oh gosh, I don't even know.
She's objectified and she's kind of condescended to, but she owns the situation whenever that happens.
Exactly. And honestly, she's the one with the gloves on her hand. She's the one with the fingers on the buttons. I wouldn't mess with Fran Kubelik in an elevator knowing what she knows at that time.
Yeah, we should point out too, you know, Maclaine in later years pointed out to people that in a lot of cases, Wilder was pretty not nice to her, treated her very poorly on set. We hear this way too often about directors in this era of Hollywood, still today, but hopefully to a lesser extent. But in those times, you know, just kind of terrorizing actresses in order to get performances out of them. And Maclaine has kind of hinted that a lot of this happened. They didn't let her ad lib. They were on her a lot about getting every single word of the script exactly right. And in some cases, people have speculated that that's probably because Wilder wanted a melancholic performance out of her or something that's like really bothering her to be shown on screen, as if she couldn't have just done that anyway. And that's the thing that rubs me, of course. But regardless, I think Maclaine is able to just really pull a performance out of this that is so believable, that is so like filled with subtext, that does get paid off later. And it's a great introduction. And I think that seeing the scene where they're all kind of like bunched up in the elevator, I was like, it's kind of nice to see people actually being close to each other again, honestly.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I miss people, places, and things. I know a lot of our listeners do. So hopefully maybe in viewing The Apartment, you can get some of that semblance of kind of normalcy back. Harken back to days when people did crowd themselves into elevators in order to get from one floor to the next.
Yeah. We see a little bit more of this banter. Eventually, we do see things are looking up for Jack Lemmon's character. At some point, he is able to kind of score a date with Fran, even though I think that she's very aloof with him. Clearly, she has other things on her mind, but she is kind of open-minded to the idea of, sure, I'll go with you to go see The Music Man. But really, this is setting the stage for a big reveal in the movie, which is that the man that she is having an affair with happens to be Sheldrake, played by Fred MacMurray, who is, of course, the boss who is basically told Jack Lemmon's character, hey, I can give you that promotion you have been looking for. And that's kind of where the drama starts to heat up. Now, we were having a little bit of a pre-discussion about this in the sense of, is The Apartment a Christmas movie or is it a New Year's Eve movie? And Julia, you seem to be firmly on the side of New Year's, correct?
It's absolutely a New Year's Eve movie. I don't understand why this is even a debate. I don't see why this should be a discussion we're having on the airwaves.
Oh my goodness.
So that people have to listen to it and take a side. I think it's so clear to me that this film is a New Year's Eve film because the apex of the entire film, the moment where all of our hearts stop beating, happens on New Year's Eve.
Right. Which we'll get to, of course. My thing with Christmas movie and New Year's Eve movies is I think that there are some movies that are categorically New Year's. There are some movies that are categorically Christmas. I think this one is both in a lot of ways, but I think the Christmas part, it's kind of like the overall holiday season, and I just label it a certain way. But maybe that's
the melancholy of Christmas. I definitely understand your perspective there. Absolutely. Not the hopefulness of the new year, but definitely the melancholy of Christmas. If that's what you're going for, then sure, absolutely.
I say all that to set the stage for a scene that happens during a Christmas party. At this point, Baxter, he seems to think that, everything's going great. He's got the promotion, he's got the office, and he's feeling a little confident. He's 3 drinks in, and we're in this office party, Christmas office party, and he decides, you know what, this is my chance to maybe make things right with the woman who stood me up. And he doesn't realize at this point, of course, that the reason she stood him up is because she has been with the very man who has been occupying his apartment.
Thank you. I thought you were avoiding me.
What gave you that idea?
In the last 6 weeks, you've only been in my elevator once, and you didn't take off your hat.
Well, as a matter of fact, I was rather hurt that night you stood me up.
I don't blame you. It was unforgivable.
I forgive you.
You shouldn't.
You couldn't help yourself. I mean, when you're having a drink with one man, you can't suddenly walk out on him because you're having another date with another man. You did the only decent thing.
I wouldn't be too sure. Just because I wear a uniform, that doesn't make me a Girl Scout.
Miss Kubelik, one doesn't get to be a second administrative assistant around here unless he's a pretty good judge of character. And as far as I'm concerned, you're tops. I mean, decency-wise and otherwise-wise. Cheers. Oh, one more.
Oh, I shouldn't drink while I'm driving.
You're so right. By the power vested in me, I herewith declare this elevator out of order. Shall we join the natives?
Why not? They seem friendly enough.
Don't you believe it? After a while, there'll be human sacrifices. White-collar workers tossed into the computing machines and punched full of those little square holes.
Before we move on, because the scene gets better and better, of course, I do want to ask you this question about just Christmas in general, Julia. Like, for a Christmas movie, you mentioned like kind of the melancholy, but what about this scene in particular? Because at this point in the scene, we see that Fran is learning the terrible news in the sense of like it's more like gossip from the secretary, who at several points in this movie, I should just quickly mention, I really related to her snoopiness in some instances, just kind of like hanging on the phone calls and eavesdropping on things. But she tells Fran at this point that, oh, I had an affair with Sheldrake as well. So did this person, and suddenly the scene dramatically shifts to being very depressing. And then we're going to play the rest of this clip in a moment. But, the cluelessness of Baxter in this point is kind of the point of the scene.
Well, before we even get into the Christmas movie and Christmas party spirit, I want to go back and kind of challenge your vernacular a little bit. I think that Jeff Sheldrake is the one who's having the affairs with these women. These women are not having affairs with Sheldrake.
Yes, good point.
Yeah, he is the married man in this situation. He has kids. These young women kind of are in the same position as C.C. Baxter, where they feel like if an older man who is in upper management notices me, likes me, treats me well, if I give him something, he might give me something in return. And obviously we have seen films before that have honestly played out that situation in more tragic ways. Honestly, The Apartment might be able to fall into one of those categories as well. But I just wanted to challenge your vernacular a little bit so we can kind of shift the dialogue and recognize that Sheldrake is the one who's having the affairs with these young women. These young women are victims of his power and his toxic masculinity, and they are not the ones who are completely complicit in those affairs as well.
And it's good that you bring that up, because there's even a point where it's not like Fran knew that going into this relationship. I mean, they make it pretty clear that, like you said, she's a victim. She's kind of with him under false pretenses, and then eventually figures out for herself that, no, he's stringing me along. He's actually married and so forth. So yes, thank you for bringing that up and correcting that. And as we move into that scene where things start to take a turn for the pretty, I don't want to say dark, but they definitely go into a sense where the movie is shifting into its real drama, the real point where Baxter kind of comes down to earth on what's really going on. I kind of wanted to point out how just the fact that, like, if you look at his character in this instance, I was curious because you brought up earlier how he seems like a nice guy. He seems like he's actually in this to be with someone, to have a real love story. But what he's doing with his apartment and trying to get ahead, I sort of get the feeling that he's on a certain path where he will probably become just like Sheldrake. He'll become just like Dobish and all the other guys who are married and had their love stories or whatever, but they prioritized work so much over themselves and not being true to themselves that now they are lonely. And like we find out from Sheldrake himself that he claims the reason he does all this is because deep down he feels he doesn't have real connection with people. And he kind of frames it around like he doesn't even understand why. And I think this movie is trying to say that it's because he constantly put work and moving up the ladder and this vague form of success over other people. And I view Baxter as a person on that trajectory, but then he has to learn for himself, no, I'm not going to do that. And that's kind of where the movie finds its theme. But do you think that's a correct reading of the film?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really fascinating reading of the film. I mean, it goes back to this whole, and I don't want to get too introspective and too potentially anti-capitalist, but at the same time, I feel like that's the whole sense of this capitalistic ideology that has been placed into so many minds in this country, even in the early 1960s. You know, we're taught this idea that you have to succeed, and in order to succeed, you either have to pay your dues or you have to pay your dues in some way. For all we know, Sheldrake's biography prior to working in this office was that he served in World War II. So why wouldn't you want to offer this man who has given everything to this country a little apartment so he can have some time with another woman on the weekends or what have you? You know, it's a really fascinating introspection on this idea of what it takes to make it in America. And especially in corporate America specifically. And I think that that's a very honest reading. I think that it offers a lot of introspection and a lot of readings and analysis into Billy Wilder's specific direction of this film that he might not have even intended at the time. But for me, it just harkens back to this idea of paying your dues, having this capitalistic ideology in your mind that if you give more than 100%, even on the side, then somehow you are going to benefit from it. And honestly, I completely agree with you. I think that for a really long time, C.C. Baxter is on this trajectory to become the next Sheldrake. But fortunately, a character like Fran Kubelik exists in this narrative who is able to remind him of the stakes and what it means to be human, what it means to feel something. Because to be honest, she's also a victim of this capitalistic ideology. She is someone who works in this corporate business office in New York, and she becomes victim to this upper management man who feels like he is owed something, who has the opportunity to give back everything if he so chooses. And yet she feels she definitely does give everything. Not only does she offer, you know, I'm sure some of her job, but she offers her personal life. She offers her emotions, her mental health. And this is a man who can't even give her the word that he will eventually divorce his wife in order to be with her. And I think that that is at this kind of very interesting crux of humanity versus, you know, working America. It's just such a fascinating reading.
Which is a great segue to get to the later part of this scene. So now they're in the office, Baxter's office, and it's a cringeworthy scene in some ways because Baxter cannot figure out that she doesn't care about his stupid hat. And he's so full of himself of like, oh, I can get you a promotion. I can do all of this. And he just doesn't see her as a person. He doesn't see that she's hurting, that she does not want to be there right now, that she is just kind of like really dealing with her own stuff at that moment, and he doesn't have the emotional intelligence to recognize that. And then this culminates in one of the scene's turning points, where I think it turns into from kind of more of a workplace comedy with some romance to the romantic drama comedy that we've been talking about.
I thought maybe I put in a word for you with Mr. Sheldrake, get you a little promotion. How would you like to be an elevator starter?
I'm afraid there are too many girls around here with seniority over me.
No problem. Why don't we discuss it sometime over the holidays? I can call you and pick you up. We have a big unveiling. Are you sure this is the right way to wear this?
I think so. Here.
You don't think it's tilted a little too much? I mean, after all, this is a conservative firm. I don't want people to think I'm an entertainer.
What's the matter?
The mirror, it's broken.
Yes, I know. I like it that way. Makes me look the way I feel.
So yeah, every time that happens in the movie, I kind of lose it emotionally. I don't know about you.
Absolutely. I think one of my favorite line readings from a movie is Shirley Maclaine as Fran Kubelik saying, "I know, I like it that way. It makes me look the way that I feel." It's just so heartbreaking, especially with the sincerity with which that she says it, as well as the matter-of-factness. You know, this makes me look the way that I feel. The intertext of that phrase is just, I'm a broken person. I'm completely broken. I want the visages of myself that I see to represent how I actually feel on the inside. It represents so much introspection, so much emotional intelligence for that character, which I have to give a little bit of credit to, the writing for this film, to Billy Wilder. That's a very profound thing for a woman to say in a film like that. And it's said without this kind of sweeping music, without a lot of, it's not the apex of the film even. And it's heartbreaking, it's heart-wrenching, and it's presented in such a matter-of-fact way that completely represents how so many women working in corporate America had to hold it together. And even when they felt broken inside, they had to keep operating those elevators. They had to keep being proficient secretaries, keep those typing times up, even when they were used and abused by their superiors who were men, and just made to feel stuck in their positions, which many of them unfortunately were. But it just layers so much. And I think that that's why it's also stood the test of time, because we know that there are so many women still working in corporate America who are working jobs who just want to look in a broken mirror and say to themselves, this represents the way that I feel inside. When it's been 60 years since the apartment happened, we should be well beyond this point where women actually feel empowered in the workplace, especially in corporate America, and we're still not there yet. We still have so many Fran Kubeliks out there.
I was looking at, because we were to talk about films that sort of can accompany this as a watch. And one of the ones that I considered was The Assistant, which came out just this year, and how that film kind of speaks a lot to what you're saying. Really just it's unbelievable how much hasn't changed in a lot of ways in these like workplace environments where men are able to basically feel empowered or entitled to other people's bodies constantly, their bodies in terms of what they do physically, sexually, and emotionally for other men in the office. And what's crazy about this, what's pretty strange about this movie is that if you look at other films around this time, you don't get a lot of stories or characters where women are in a position who they're more sympathetic for what they're going through in this situation. Usually when adultery was happening on screen in movies at this time, they were way more villainized, or they were, there is a moment where she attempts to commit suicide, but the film doesn't frame her as pathetic. It doesn't frame her as stupid or dumb for any of this. Instead, it shows her like really what she's going through is very profound and very terrible. And the manipulation that she went through is what drove her to this. And I thought that was very, very interesting to see in a film made in this time, especially by someone who, by all accounts, Billy Wilder himself did have a very strained relationship with women in general. He had his heart broken by a woman who, when he lived in Vienna, who reportedly he found out that she was a prostitute. This was a place where prostitution was legal. And people have said that ever since that happened, he felt very scarred by women. And, women who have worked with him on set have alleged that, you know, he really just didn't understand women in a lot of ways. A lot of people credit I.A.L. Diamond for sort of helping fill in those gaps in a lot of these scripts, because that's an obvious disconnect with some of what we see here. But I do think that that kind of resonates with just the way he views women as like people he doesn't fully understand, but he seems to have some sort of I don't want to say sympathy for, but like he's trying to empathize, or his story is trying to put them, you know, in a place that isn't just, you know, she had an affair, she did something bad, she had sex out of wedlock, she has to die, which was such a terrible trope in this time. And I really appreciate this movie for not going there. Of course, it falls into its own tropes, which we might bring up. But yeah, I every time I see this movie, that's all I can think about is how refreshing that is to see for a movie from this era.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I think I mentioned this very early at the beginning of this episode. I just feel like she, of the characters, is probably the most emotionally complicated. And it has to do with her circumstances. It has to do with how she handles a lot of those circumstances. And I completely agree with you. I think it's really profound. And I too understand that Billy Wilder had an incredibly strained relationship with a lot of the leading ladies of his films, a lot of the women who led his films. I mean, there are stories upon stories of how he treated Marilyn Monroe with Some Like It Hot, which
right,
are just
yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah, absolutely abysmal. And no one deserved to be treated that way. I'm sure that that lent itself to a lot of the trauma that carried over throughout the rest of her career and into her very short life. And I know for sure that Shirley Maclaine was a victim and definitely suffered at the trauma of dealing with that in the workplace too, which is really fascinating considering that this is kind of a workplace romantic dramedy. I feel like that's a whole other conversation analysis take for another time, but yeah, I've always loved Fran Kubelik as a character. I think that she is one of the more emotionally intelligent. She's the most emotionally intelligent character in this film. And I just, you know, I relate to so much of how she feels in terms of just kind of having to maintain this stagnation career-wise, having to maintain this stagnation in her personal life in order to just, you know, continue on, you know, moving that elevator up and down. It's just, she's one of my favorite characters in cinema. I just love her so much. And I think I really give a lot of credit to the narrative of this film. I really do feel like that buildup really does lend itself to not look at Fran Kubelik as a pathetic character when she does try to commit suicide. You really do feel for this woman. And if you don't, I have some questions about your own emotional intelligence. It's just, you know, I don't really have a lot of articulation for it, but it's very powerful to see a woman just at the end of her ropes, at her last wit's end, just going to that length, because that's how much she cares about this man. That's how much she feels like she can continue on in her life. And that's how much she feels like she's been used, and what else is she good for other than being used? There are so many layers to it. And I just feel like it's such a willful ignorance to just write it off as just her trying to kill herself because she can't be with the guy that she wants to be with. Like,
she knows that he's not good for her. Mm-hmm. And it points out that that's not how love works. And it's something that's filled with suffering. And you get that sense, you know, you and I've seen you quote this so many times. I do the same. Why do people have to love people anyway? You know, I couldn't relate more to that question. Yeah. It is a very difficult aspect of human nature that we fall into the situation so often. And, you know, even in that scene in particular, I particularly noticed this time how she's not really talking to Baxter. She's talking to the camera. She's talking to the audience. I feel like, because she even mentioned she's from Pittsburgh. I think she's talking to you, Julia.
Maybe she might be. I mean, I just look at that scene. I love that line too. It's one of my favorites, and I think that it's, Shirley Maclaine delivers it so nonchalantly, but it's such a profound thing to say in a film from the 1960s. Why do people have to fall in love anyway? I mean, it's the stuff that movie magic was made of back in that time period. It's just why people went to the movies, to be swept up in romance. And it's so profound to see this heroine on the screen just kind of like slough it off and just say, I don't get it. I don't get the draw. I don't get what the point is. I was a schmuck who fell into it. I don't get it anymore. I don't want it. I love it.
It sounds like you're kind of in the same boat where I am, where, every time I watch this movie, it's like a chapter of my life, or a different chapter of my life that I'm in the middle of. I didn't start watching this movie once a year until the last few years, because like it's one of those movies that became more seminal as I got older and as I revisited it. One of the first times that happened was a few years ago. I was watching this on a plane of all places. And you're not going to believe this, Julia. I was on my way back from a Christmas vacation when I watched it. How about that? But as we wind down, let's kind of just, finish this out with some final thoughts on the movie in general. The last thing I want to bring up is the music that we kind of teased we would mention earlier. Just the sense that we first hear the score at the very beginning of the film, but then we hear it again, the Adolf Deutsch score, which was actually adapted from existing music that Billy Wilder actually really liked. Now, this went on to completely overshadow the popularity of that music. It's actually pretty hard to find these days, but it's actually based off of something else. It's not very original in that sense, but it still fits the movie like a glove, mainly because Wilder had heard it before. And he specifically, it seems like he wrote the movie around the feeling the music evokes. But what I love is how a scene earlier in the film, when Fran is going to the Chinese restaurant and she asks the piano player to play this song, there's like a little subplot going on there where that music actually represents the way she feels about Sheldrake, and he doesn't seem to hear it. And she brings him the record for Christmas, and he just gives her $100 or whatever it is. And when we start to hear the music more, it carries on like a new meaning. Not a lot of movies do that sort of thing to the point where even the main protagonist, Baxter, finds record and is like, this isn't mine. And it's sort of playing around with the idea of how do you start a new romance with someone when you have this very specific music of life like tied to another person. And this film is so good at telling a story of how hard that is, because most films don't. They sort of just like gloss over it and are like, well, they have so much chemistry, it's going to overpower, all of that. But that's not really how this progresses. There's actually like weeks go by, or like at least days go by before the next thing happens. It doesn't all happen within a few days like some of these movies do. And I think that's what makes the film so special, so that when you do finally get to the ending, which maybe we can play once we finish things out, it just feels earned, and it just feels like you really watched an important moment out of these two people's lives that means something and wasn't easy to get to.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I mentioned it before. I love the music from this movie. I think that it really hits a lot of the emotional pinpoints that maybe not a lot of the dialogue lends itself to. Maybe the dialogue might be a little bit too vague or a little bit too whip smart for some people to keep up with sometimes. And I think that in that way, the music really lends itself to a lot of the emotional tension of a lot of scenes, especially the one that you brought up when Fran and Sheldrake go to the restaurant and she asks them to play that old tune or what have you. It's really pivotal. I think that the one scene that you previously played with the mirror in Frank Kubelik's Compact, I think that immediately goes to the crux of how she's feeling internally. It's a really beautiful thing. And I mean, obviously, this composer went on to win 3 Oscars, was nominated for a plethora of awards. So they know what they're doing. And this was just an early showing of the talent. They went on to do so much for Annie Get Your Gun and Oklahoma and a number of other movie musicals. So it just really speaks to the power of music. And I don't think I would be wrong in saying that The Apartment probably is a cue for some composers in terms of how to match character introspection and their emotions to the music that's playing.
Should we play a clip from the final scene of the movie to wrap up our conversation?
Let's do it. Let's prove why this is a New Year's Eve movie.
Oh boy. Well, that said, so we get to the end of the film and Auld Acquaintance Be Forgot. That song is playing. All Lang Syne, of course. And, there's this moment in the film where you think all is lost and Fran's with the wrong guy. But then Sheldrake, he messes up. He does the thing. He tells her what Baxter did. Quit his job, and he told Sheldrake, basically, you can't have my apartment anymore. You can't put Miss Kubelik through that anymore. I forgot to mention, by the way, I have a real fascination with the way this movie plays around with calling people by their last names and their first names and the formalness of it. And I think it's pretty fascinating. That's a discussion for another day. And it does kind of play into the themes of the movie. Are you a human being or are you just a title? Anyway. And then she hears this from Sheldrake and disappears at the swell of the song. And then we see her running to Baxter's apartment. She thinks that he's committed suicide, which the film sort of builds up 2 times with his story of shooting himself over heartbreak. And then eventually we see him with putting a gun into a box. But of course he's okay. And then the two of them in the final moments of the film have this heart to heart.
What about Mr. Sheldrake?
We send him a fruitcake every Christmas. Cut.
I love you, Miss Kubelik.
3. Queen.
Did you hear what I said, Miss Kubelik? I absolutely adore you.
Shut up and deal.
I mean, that's just movie magic, I guess is the name for it.
I think it might be. It might be the definition of it. I'm not sure. God, I love the ending of that movie so much. And that's part of the reason why I will firmly stake my stance and die on the hill that this is a New Year's Eve movie, because it presents so much hope. And what does a new year represent?
Yes,
hope.
yes.
A clean slate, moving forward with so many inhibitions out the door, and it happens on New Year's Eve. They're singing Old Lang Syne in the restaurant. I mean, how much better can you get than that? And then Shirley Maclaine's line delivery of "shut up and deal."
And a smile.
Just
what a sparkle.
Just the best. Just the best. It's so good. It's so good. This movie is so good, you guys.